The hearing room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Congressional hearings often have the appearance of ritual. Carefully scripted questions, measured responses, and a steady rhythm of formal procedure. But what unfolded that day was anything but ordinary. Senator Peter Welch, calm and deliberate, leaned forward in his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need theatrics. His strategy was simple but devastating. Documentation, precise questioning, and expose your reality against rhetoric. Across from him sat Patel, director of the FBI, already aware that the usual rehearsed answers wouldn't suffice. Welch began with a pointed observation. An FBI plane flew round trip from D.C. to Las Vegas, he said, his voice steady but carrying an unspoken edge. You attended a UFC fight with Mel Gibson. I'll show you that. Is that you? And is that true? Patel's response was brief, almost offensive. Yeah, he admitted. There was a hesitation, a subtle acknowledgement that this was not a simple operational necessity. Welch continued, cutting to the heart of the matter. Do you want to know the difference? He leaned in slightly, the room attentive to his cadence. I live in Las Vegas. I'm allowed to go home. I didn't leave a congressional hearing early on an FBI jet to dodge questions. That line landed. It was not a flourish. It was a moral and operational contrast. Welch was highlighting a gap between everyday law enforcement officers' realities and the privileges afforded to leadership. For rank-and-file agents, going home meant adhering to strict policies, often paying their own way or using routine commercial flights. For Patel, taxpayer-funded jets became a means to leisure, a symbol of separation from the very standards he oversaw. Patel attempted to justify the optics, citing precedent and policy. Well, everyday FBI agents who are signed in Washington don't get to fly home on a private jet, he said, trying to normalize the situation. Welch didn't flinch. He pressed on layer by layer, demonstrating the incongruity. Do you know why I have to use a private jet? Patel continued, as if reclaiming control, because Congress made it mandatory. The argument, though, failed to land. Welch was relentless. Well, we didn't make it mandatory that you go to UFC games with Mel Gibson. Are you telling me I can't go home? Patel tried to assert judgment as a defense. You know, you've got to use some judgment here. So when I'm at home, I can't do what I'm doing. When I go home, everybody else is allowed to go home. But the optics were inescapable. The public, the media, and the oversight mechanisms witnessed a stark contrast. Patel using multi-million-dollar taxpayer-funded assets for celebrity-filled leisure events in cities where he didn't even reside, while FBI agents risking their lives in field operations adhered to stricter travel norms. Then Welch escalated the scrutiny, introducing another layer, personnel and integrity within the FBI. He brought up Brian Driscoll, a decorated agent whose career exemplified bravery, leadership, and operational excellence. Driscoll had served for over 18 years, commanded the FBI's hostage rescue team, and overseen 55 SWAT teams. He had been part of high-stakes international operations, including hostage rescues from ISIS captors, and had earned a Medal of Valor. Welch methodically walked Patel through the facts, asking questions that highlighted the contradiction between professional dedication and administrative consequences. Do you agree with me that a boss who stands up for his subordinates when they did the job that was asked of them is a stand-up person and somebody to be admired? Patel answered cautiously, generally speaking, yes, sir. Welch didn't hesitate to press further. But Driscoll got fired, right? Patel's response was careful, almost evasive. Again, that matter is under litigation, and the matter you reference occurred before I was... Let's just keep it fairly narrow here. Welch, however, wasn't interested in polite evasions. He has to be there. Somebody communicates to him that he's terminated. That's your job. So, you communicated to him that he was fired. Patel confirmed. I did. At this point, the room felt the weight of the exchange. Welch's questions were not rhetorical. They were moral, operational, and deeply structural. The juxtaposition was clear. An agent risking his life in service and upholding the oath, dismissed for defending his team. The director using privileged assets for celebrity-attended leisure events. I have a hard time with this, Welch said, his tone calm but firm. This person is worthy of consideration for the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and yet got fired for standing up for his team. The broader lesson was undeniable. Accountability, integrity, and leadership were on trial, not just a single decision. Welch's questioning framed the narrative. When leadership prioritizes optics, celebrity, or political loyalty over operational excellence and the welfare of subordinates, the institution itself is at risk. This first segment of the hearing set the tone. It was about more than a jet or a UFC flight. It was about the moral compass of the FBI, about the contrast between everyday sacrifice and selective privilege, and about exposing the consequences when personal convenience eclipses public service. Welch had begun with a plane ride, but by the time the exchange concluded, he had illuminated the profound ethical questions at the heart of federal law enforcement leadership. The tension in the hearing room had only intensified after the UFC flight questioning. Senator Peter Welch, armed with flight records and a meticulous timeline, shifted focus seamlessly to another instance of apparent privilege, Coast Patel's use of FBI resources for personal travel. Then on April 5th, you attended a hockey game in New York City. Welch began, his voice steady but firm. You don't live there, right? Patel acknowledged, No, I don't. The room seemed to tighten around the unspoken implications. Welch's follow-up was surgical. Everyday FBI agents signed in Washington do not get to use private jets for leisure or travel to cities unrelated to official duty. Yet here was a director comfortably boarding an FBI plane for a hockey game. Patel tried to justify his actions, citing mandated travel policies. Do you know why I have to use a private jet? Because Congress made it mandatory, he said. Welch, undeterred, highlighted the distinction between operational necessity and personal convenience. Well, we didn't make it mandatory that you go to UFC games or hockey games in cities where you don't reside, he replied, emphasizing the optics of the situation. The exchange illuminated a stark inequity. Regular agents follow the rules and bear the personal cost of travel, while leadership enjoys taxpayer-funded convenience with little public accountability. Welch then contextualized this pattern, juxtaposing Patel's actions with the values and risks of the FBI's operational teams. This was not simply about flights. It was about institutional priorities and leadership judgment. By flying to a hockey game in New York, Patel appeared to blur the lines between personal leisure and professional duty, raising questions about his ability to exercise discernment in a role that demanded rigorous ethical and operational decision-making. The senator's questioning subtly but powerfully underscored a broader issue, the optics of power and the perception of misuse of government resources.
Flight records were central to Welch's line of questioning. He methodically walked through the timeline, demonstrating that Patel's use of the FBI jet was neither isolated nor purely operational. It became clear that these trips were part of a recurring pattern. The optics of attending VIP sporting events in cities where he did not live, under the guise of official duty, stood in stark contrast to the lived reality of the agents he led. These were agents who routinely risked their lives without expectation of luxury or celebrity access. Welch's pointed questions drew attention to a critical theme. Leadership privileges must be balanced against fairness, transparency, and institutional integrity. The hearing exposed more than procedural lapses. It highlighted a growing perception of elitism within the agency. The contrast between Patel's leisure travel and the professional sacrifices of his subordinates made the situation unmistakable. Welch's approach was subtle yet devastating, allowing the evidence and the timeline to speak louder than rhetoric. The senator's questioning wasn't an attack for its own sake. It was an unflinching examination of whether those in power adhered to the same standards expected of those they led. The hockey game in New York became a symbol, a tangible example of how public resources could be used in ways that appeared self-serving, eroding trust and calling into question judgment at the highest levels of the FBI. By the end of this segment, the pattern was undeniable. Welch had laid out a clear narrative. This was not an isolated misstep, but part of a broader pattern of questionable travel and privileges that directly contradicted the principles of accountability, fairness, and public service. The juxtaposition of everyday agents' sacrifices against Patel's private jet excursions created a visual and ethical contrast that resonated deeply in the room. It was a powerful moment of oversight, shining a light on the gap between what leadership claimed to value and the choices they made when unobserved. The scrutiny intensified as Senator Welch turned to another episode of Patel's use of FBI resources, this time focusing on Miami. Flight tracker data, meticulously compiled, showed a clear pattern. The FBI jet, intended for operational and emergency purposes, was being used to transport the director to leisure events across the country. On the weekend of April 12th, you attended a UFC fight in Miami. Also on the FBI jet, correct? Welch asked, his tone calm yet incisive. Patel confirmed the fact, attempting to couch it in procedural language. That's correct. Welch's response was methodical. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make accusations. Instead, he laid out the facts, allowing the evidence to tell the story. So, what's the cost to the taxpayer for these 3 flights? He asked, framing the discussion around accountability rather than conjecture. Patel attempted a defense, noting that he paid the commercial equivalent of the flight in accordance with statutory allowances. But Welch had anticipated this response and quickly pivoted to the optics and consistency of leadership behavior. He emphasized that, while Patel might comply with the letter of the law, the use of a multi-million-dollar government jet for personal leisure events created a perception problem that could not be ignored. The Miami trip was not an isolated case. It was part of a pattern that included Las Vegas and New York, each instance revealing a growing gap between privilege and responsibility. Welch highlighted this sequence to underscore the disparity between Patel's access to resources and the realities faced by rank-and-file agents. These were agents who routinely risked their lives, often traveling under strict budget and operational constraints. Unlike Patel, they did not have the benefit of a private jet, nor did they have the latitude to conflate personal leisure with professional duty. By walking through each flight, Welch painted a picture that went beyond logistics. He exposed a culture in which leadership privileges, when exercised without transparency or restraint, could erode trust and diminish public confidence. The Miami UFC fight, with its celebrity attendees and high-profile setting, became emblematic of this broader issue. Welch emphasized that operational necessity could never justify patterns of travel that appeared self-serving, particularly when juxtaposed against the dedication and sacrifice of career FBI personnel. Furthermore, Welch contextualized the impact of these choices within the broader framework of public service and budget priorities. He asked Patel to compare his use of the jet with prior FBI directors, noting that the agency had multiple fixed-wing assets and that Patel had previously criticized such expenditures when others employed them. The contradiction was stark. A director who once called for fiscal restraint now used high-cost resources for personal convenience, even if within legal parameters. Welch's questioning forced Patel to confront the tension between optics and legality, between procedural compliance and ethical leadership. The Miami example also underscored the inequities inherent in the system. Welch drew attention to the broader implications for morale and trust within the FBI. When agents observed their leader using government resources for high-profile, leisure-oriented trips while their own sacrifices went largely unrecognized, it created a chasm between leadership and the workforce. Welch made the point clear. This was not merely about flights or destinations. It was about the perception of fairness, the responsibility to uphold institutional integrity, and the importance of leading by example. By the conclusion of this segment, the narrative was unmistakable. Welch had taken a series of seemingly mundane flights and transformed them into a case study on accountability, judgment, and the ethical use of public resources. The Miami UFC trip was not a standalone event. It was part of a discernible pattern that demanded explanation and reflection. Through precise questioning and careful presentation of the facts, Welch highlighted the stakes. Leadership decisions, even when legally defensible, have consequences for institutional culture, public trust, and the perception of fairness within one of the nation's most critical agencies. By the time the hearing reached its final phase, it had become clear that this was more than a routine line of questioning. Senator Peter Welch had methodically exposed a series of patterns in Patel's leadership, patterns that illuminated the tension between public service and personal privilege, between procedural compliance and ethical responsibility. Welch's line of questioning had revealed the discrepancies. UFC flights to Las Vegas, a hockey game in New York, A UFC event in Miami, each instance documented, each instance requiring explanation. Yet, Patel's justifications often circled back to technical compliance, leaving the broader ethical questions unresolved. At the heart of Welch's approach was the story of Brian Driscoll, a highly decorated FBI agent whose career exemplified courage, leadership, and dedication. Driscoll had led the FBI's hostage rescue team, commanded SWAT teams, earned a Medal of Valor, and risked his life in both international and domestic operations. Yet, Driscoll was terminated for actions that, on their face, represented steadfast adherence to his duties and protection of his subordinates. By juxtaposing Driscoll's record with Patel's pattern of privileged travel, Welch made a profound point. Leadership is measured not only by technical authority, but by the ethical and moral standards one upholds. Welch's questioning illuminated a broader institutional truth. Leadership, especially in critical agencies like the FBI, is not about the selective exercise of power for personal convenience. It is about the stewardship of resources, the protection of employees who perform dangerous work, and the maintenance of public trust. By pressing Patel on these issues, Welch highlighted how decisions made behind closed doors, seemingly minor choices about travel, privileging, or firing, can ripple outward, affecting morale, operational integrity, and the public's perception of the Bureau. The segment of the hearing dedicated to oversight and accountability also addressed the fiscal implications of leadership decisions. Welch contrasted Patel's private jet usage with the needs of local law enforcement, noting the reduction of vital COP grants. These grants, essential for supporting officers in towns and cities across the nation, directly impact public safety. By drawing attention to the contrast between lavish leadership privileges and the underfunding of frontline law enforcement, Welch framed the discussion within the broader context of resource allocation, responsibility, and governance. What made this segment particularly compelling was Welch's ability to allow the evidence to speak for itself. He did not need to raise his voice or engage in hyperbole. Flight records, budget analyses, service records, and documented timelines created a narrative that required no embellishment. Patel's own explanations, or lack thereof, became part of the evidence. The contrast between his privileged travel and the sacrifices of ordinary agents formed a vivid illustration of leadership accountability. Ultimately, this portion of the hearing distilled the moral of the entire session. Oversight is essential. Democracy functions when elected officials, committees, and the public have access to transparent and honest reporting from those in power. Welch's interrogation underscored that when leaders prioritize convenience, optics, or political loyalty over institutional integrity, the consequences extend far beyond individual actions. The culture of an agency, the morale of its employees, and the public trust it commands are all at stake. As the hearing concluded, the broader lesson was undeniable. Government institutions thrive when guided by expertise, ethical responsibility, and unwavering accountability. When leaders allow privilege to overshadow service, when they punish integrity instead of protecting it, the entire system becomes vulnerable. Senator Welch's meticulous examination of Patel's actions offered a stark warning. Democracy demands vigilance, transparency, and principled leadership. The episode served as a reminder that oversight is not a formality. It is the lifeline that preserves institutional integrity, safeguards public resources, and ensures that those entrusted with power exercise it responsibly. As the hearing progressed, Senator Peter Welch shifted focus from individual flights to the broader narrative of leadership, ethics, and accountability within the FBI. By this point, the pattern was undeniable. Coase Patel's repeated use of the FBI jet for personal or celebrity-adjacent travel, juxtaposed with the termination of highly decorated agents like Brian Driscoll, painted a picture of leadership that prioritized convenience and optics over institutional integrity. Welch's strategy was clear. He was not merely asking questions. He was constructing a narrative in which every detail, from flight records to personnel decisions, exposed a fundamental misalignment between claimed values and actual practices. Welch emphasized the human element, highlighting that the actions of those in power have tangible consequences for the workforce. Driscoll's termination became emblematic of this. He had spent nearly 2 decades serving the FBI, leading elite teams, and executing high-stakes operations with precision and courage. Yet, he was dismissed not because of incompetence or negligence, but because he had the audacity to stand up for agents performing the duties assigned to them, duties that included sensitive investigations connected to January 6th. Through this lens, Welch framed Patel's actions as a case study in the dangers of leadership that prioritizes political expediency over professional judgment. The line of questioning regarding taxpayer-funded travel also illustrated the contrast between rank-and-file sacrifices and executive privilege. Welch walked Patel through the timeline: Las Vegas UFC flights, the New York City hockey game, and the Miami UFC fight. Each example highlighted an increasingly clear pattern of using operational assets for personal enjoyment, often in ways that regular agents could never access. Welch allowed the evidence, flight logs, event schedules, and Patel's own admissions, to speak for itself, creating a narrative that was both factual and damning. The questioning also underscored the optics of leadership. When those in positions of power appear to exploit resources for personal gain, the perception of the agency suffers. Morale among career agents erodes, trust in leadership diminishes, and public confidence in the organization is undermined. Welch framed this as not just a procedural concern but a moral one. Leadership is measured not solely by authority but by integrity, fairness, and the ability to protect the people serving under you. By the end of this segment, it was evident that Welch's approach was surgical. He didn't need to make hyperbolic claims or rely on conjecture. Every question, every document, every carefully timed follow-up exposed the contradictions in Patel's explanations. The juxtaposition of privileged leisure, questionable decision-making, and the dismissal of career agents who upheld the mission of the FBI created a compelling portrait of leadership failure. In doing so, Welch reminded viewers and lawmakers alike that oversight is not optional. It is the mechanism through which public trust is maintained, accountability is enforced, and the principles of justice are preserved. As the hearing progressed, Senator Peter Welch shifted focus from individual flights to the broader narrative of leadership, ethics, and accountability within the FBI. By this point, the pattern was undeniable. Coase Patel's repeated use of the FBI jet for personal or celebrity-adjacent travel, juxtaposed with the termination of highly decorated agents like Brian Driscoll, painted a picture of leadership that prioritized convenience and optics over institutional integrity. Welch's strategy was clear. He was not merely asking questions. He was constructing a narrative in which every detail, from flight records to personnel decisions, exposed a fundamental misalignment between claimed values and actual practices. Welch emphasized the human element, highlighting that the actions of those in power have tangible consequences for the workforce. Driscoll's termination became emblematic of this. He had spent nearly 2 decades serving the FBI, leading elite teams, and executing high-stakes operations with precision and courage. Yet, he was dismissed not because of incompetence or negligence, but because he had the audacity to stand up for agents performing the duties assigned to them, duties that included sensitive investigations connected to January 6th. Through this lens, Welch framed Patel's actions as a case study in the dangers of leadership that prioritizes political expediency over professional judgment. The line of questioning regarding taxpayer-funded travel also illustrated the contrast between rank-and-file sacrifices and executive privilege. Welch walked Patel through the timeline: Las Vegas UFC flights, the New York City hockey game, and the Miami UFC fight. Each example highlighted an increasingly clear pattern of using operational assets for personal enjoyment, often in ways that regular agents could never access. Welch allowed the evidence, flight logs, event schedules, and Patel's own admissions to speak for itself, creating a narrative that was both factual and damning. The questioning also underscored the optics of leadership. When those in positions of power appear to exploit resources for personal gain, the perception of the agency suffers. Morale among career agents erodes, trust in leadership diminishes, and public confidence in the organization is undermined. Welch framed this as not just a procedural concern but a moral one. Leadership is measured not solely by authority but by integrity, fairness, and the ability to protect the people serving under you. By the end of the segment, it was evident that Welch's approach was surgical. He didn't need to make hyperbolic claims or rely on conjecture. Every question, every document, every carefully timed follow-up exposed the contradictions in Patel's explanations. The juxtaposition of privileged leisure, questionable decision-making, and the dismissal of career agents who upheld the mission of the FBI created a compelling portrait of leadership failure. In doing so, Welch reminded viewers and lawmakers alike that oversight is not optional. It is the mechanism through which public trust is maintained, accountability is enforced, and the principles of justice are preserved. As the hearing unfolded, Senator Welch shifted from individual flights and personnel issues to the broader implications of leadership decisions on public safety and fiscal responsibility. He drew attention to the fact that local law enforcement agencies, particularly in smaller states like Vermont, were being shortchanged. Approximately $500 million in COP grants, critical funding that helps local police maintain staffing, purchase equipment, and support community safety programs, had been removed from the budget. These grants were not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They directly affected officers on the ground, officers who partner with federal agencies to keep communities safe. Welch's line of questioning highlighted the contrast between high-cost travel for the FBI director and the underfunding of those who were actually providing frontline protection. Patel attempted to clarify his position, suggesting that grant decisions were under the purview of the Department of Justice rather than the FBI itself. While technically accurate, this explanation did little to assuage the broader concern. The allocation of federal resources reflects leadership priorities, and optics matter. Welch underscored that while local law enforcement was struggling to maintain operations, the FBI under Patel's leadership was pursuing expensive assets, including discussions of a replacement aircraft reportedly costing tens of millions of dollars. This juxtaposition was stark and illustrative. On one side were local police fighting for survival-level funding. On the other was an agency director using multi-million-dollar jets for both operational and leisure purposes. Welch pressed further, emphasizing the moral dimension of budget allocation. Decisions about resources are not neutral, they communicate values. When funds are diverted away from agencies that directly serve communities in need, it sends a signal about what leadership considers important. Welch framed the issue in human terms, highlighting the impact on officers who rely on federal support for essential operational needs. Patrol officers, investigators, and local units tasked with emergency response face real-world consequences when grants are cut or redirected. In contrast, extravagant or non-essential spending at the top level fosters resentment and erodes trust, both internally among personnel and externally among the public. The senator's questioning also highlighted the need for transparency and accountability in budgeting. Taxpayer money is finite, and leadership decisions dictate how it is used. Welch juxtaposed Patel's private jet travel and operational spending against the missed opportunities to fund programs that enhance public safety and support local law enforcement partnerships. By doing so, he reframed the conversation from isolated incidents of perceived misuse to systemic issues of priority setting, demonstrating how executive choices at the federal level ripple outward and directly affect communities across the country. By the end of the segment, the pattern was clear. Leadership decisions, particularly regarding budgets and resource allocation, have real-world consequences that extend beyond individual convenience or public perception. Welch's approach tied together the micro-level issues of flight usage and personnel decisions with macro-level concerns about fiscal responsibility and public safety. He effectively demonstrated that leadership is not only about authority, but about judgment, integrity, and the capacity to balance the needs of the entire institution and the communities it serves. This segment underscored the central argument of the hearing. Oversight matters, priorities matter, and accountability is essential to preserving the mission and credibility of federal law enforcement.
As the hearing approached its final phases, the focus shifted from specific flights and budget questions to the deeper issues of leadership, institutional integrity, and the moral compass guiding the FBI under Patel. Senator Welch carefully framed his line of questioning to expose not just isolated decisions, but a pattern of leadership behavior that threatened to erode the very foundation of one of the nation's most critical law enforcement agencies. It was no longer merely about taxpayer-funded flights or personnel actions. It was about how power was exercised at the top and how that power affected the culture, morale, and ethical standards of the institution as a whole. Welch highlighted the disconnect between public rhetoric and private actions. Patel had repeatedly defended his travel on the FBI jet as legally permissible and operationally necessary, yet these explanations failed to address the broader questions of optics, judgment, and fairness. Welch's approach emphasized that leadership is judged not only by adherence to rules, but by the consistent application of principles. When elite resources are used for personal convenience, while career agents, those executing the FBI's mission, are held to far stricter standards, the result is an imbalance that undermines both morale and credibility. The conversation turns sharply to political loyalty versus professional integrity. Welch underscored that agents like Brian Driscoll were dismissed not due to incompetence or negligence, but for upholding the oath they swore and for protecting subordinates who were carrying out legally mandated investigations, including cases related to January 6th. This was more than an HR issue. It was a case study in how political considerations can compromise institutional judgment. Welch asked, implicitly and explicitly, whether the agency's leadership could truly be trusted to prioritize the mission over optics, politics, or convenience. Patel's careful and cautious responses illustrated the tension between self-preservation and principled leadership, leaving the committee and the public to judge the implications. The segment also explored how such leadership choices influence institutional culture. When political loyalty and appearances are rewarded, while integrity and merit are penalized, the organization's values shift. Welch framed this dynamic as a systemic risk. The longer such patterns persist, the more the FBI risks becoming an agency where advancement and recognition are tied to conformity and political expediency, rather than operational excellence and ethical decision-making. By juxtaposing Patel's travel privileges with Driscoll's termination, Welch illuminated the cultural consequences of leadership decisions that reward convenience and punish principled behavior. In addition, Welch highlighted the long-term operational risks. The FBI depends on a highly trained and experienced workforce, capable of handling high-stakes, dangerous missions. When leadership sends signals that loyalty and optics outweigh skill, bravery, and adherence to the law, it jeopardizes institutional readiness. The careers of elite agents, their willingness to act decisively, and the agency's ability to respond to threats all become compromised. The broader message was clear. The health of the institution is inseparable from the integrity of its leadership. The hearing's conclusion was not simply an ending. It was a revelation. Senator Peter Welch had meticulously constructed a narrative that exposed patterns of leadership, privilege, and institutional risk within the FBI under Coast Patel. By methodically presenting flight logs, personnel records, and budgetary data, Welch demonstrated how decisions at the top reverberate through the organization, affecting morale, operational effectiveness, and public trust. Each example, the UFC flights to Las Vegas and Miami, the hockey game in New York, and the firing of highly decorated agents like Brian Driscoll, serve as a thread weaving together a larger story. The gap between rhetoric and action, between claimed values and lived reality. Welch's questioning revealed that leadership is not measured solely by authority, operational control, or compliance with the letter of the law. True leadership is judged by ethical consistency, the protection of subordinates, the fair allocation of resources, and the preservation of institutional integrity. The firing of Driscoll, an agent with near 2 decades of service and a record of bravery and leadership, stood in stark contrast to the leisure privileges afforded to the director. Welch highlighted that this disparity was not only a matter of optics. It signaled a broader risk to the FBI's culture, in which integrity and merit could be sidelined in favor of political loyalty or convenience. The hearings also underscored the critical importance of oversight. Government functions, particularly in law enforcement and national security, rely on mechanisms that ensure accountability. Welch's approach illustrated how evidence-based scrutiny, flight records, documented budgets, and service histories can pierce through rehearsed narratives and justifications, holding leaders to the standards expected by the public and the law. The juxtaposition of taxpayer-funded travel for personal or leisure purposes against the underfunding of essential local law enforcement programs made the consequences of misaligned priorities tangible. Communities and frontline officers rely on prudent leadership and judicious use of resources, Yet the pattern Welch exposed suggests a misalignment that threatened both operational readiness and public trust. Beyond the specifics of flights, firings, and budgets, Welch's questioning illuminated a universal truth about public service. Privilege without accountability corrodes institutions. When leadership decisions prioritize convenience, celebrity access, or optics over mission and ethical responsibility, the consequences extend far beyond immediate office. They affect morale, culture, operational effectiveness, and ultimately, the public's confidence in critical agencies. Welch framed these issues not as isolated complaints, but as systemic vulnerabilities, offering a warning to all who hold power. Oversight is not optional. It is a lifeline that maintains the integrity and function of democracy. In the closing moments, the broader implications became clear. The hearing was about more than an FBI director or a series of controversial flights. It was a case study in how institutions succeed or fail, depending on the ethical framework and judgment of those at the top. Welch demonstrated that transparency, adherence to principle, and protection of personnel who uphold a mission are non-negotiable pillars of effective leadership. The public, the workforce, and the democratic system itself depend on these standards being upheld. Ultimately, this segment served as a reflection on the essential nature of oversight, the importance of principled leadership, and the consequences of allowing convenience, political loyalty, or personal privilege to override ethics and mission. The lesson was clear. Democracy thrives not merely on laws or policies, but on vigilant oversight, the courage to hold leaders accountable, and a steadfast commitment to integrity at every level of public service. The hearing left a resonant message for viewers, lawmakers, and public servants alike. When leadership fails, institutions falter, but when oversight is rigorous and principles guide action, democracy is safeguarded.